All right, guys, welcome back. Thanks for joining me again. Today we are going to continue our lecture of the American Civil War. And today we're going to take a look at some of the key leadership positions in both the North and the South. We'll also take a look at the strategies of both the Northern and Southern armies going into this thing. Last time we talked a lot about the resources, and we saw that a lot of the resources tend to benefit the North. But we mentioned that that was not, the North was not destined to win this war. And in fact, there's going to be in fact, the first half of the war, really, the Northern Army is going to get whooped, especially along the Eastern Theater. Infrastructure, population, it only goes so far. I mean, really, strategy has a lot to do with it. And like we mentioned, the one plus that the Southern leadership really has is that they do have a lot of great generals that understand strategy, and they are going to be using the best strategy that they know how, and they're going to gain a lot of important victories, especially early on. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and pull up the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and pick back up where we ended our last unit at 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, I'm going to be reviewing some of the same details that we talked about last unit, but obviously this is an important starting point for the war itself. I am going to break the war up into the 4 years of fighting, and we'll talk about this in a chronological manner. There will be a couple times that we stop along the way and we talk about specific campaigns, or we'll talk about specific regions and what's happening there. And we might go back in time, we might go forward a little bit, but for the most part, our lecture is going to be based in chronological order, and we'll kind of be bouncing around between the various theaters of the war. Well, let's talk about Fort Sumter. So a reminder, at this point, 1861, South Carolina has seceded. They seceded as a result of the election of 1860 and the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, remember, Lincoln would not be inaugurated until March. At this time, March 4th was the inauguration day for all incoming presidents. So this is a little over a month after Lincoln has actually taken office. Keep that in mind, kind of the timing of all of this. Also, look at the map in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see Charleston Harbor, and you'll see where Fort Sumter is located. You have a drawing of the fort in the lower left-hand corner. The fort was originally designed for around 650 men, but by the time we reached April 12th, 1861, there are only about 125 men in the fort at that time. The day after Lincoln's inauguration, on March 5th, he is told by advisors that the fort has less than 6 weeks left worth of food left in its supply. They're going to have to do something about Fort Sumter, and he knew this was a flashpoint. He knew that if he played his cards wrong, this could ignite a war. He understood that this could divide Southern opinion. I mean, this was going to be a flashpoint. He understood. So he had to look at all the options fully and had to make an educated decision on what to do. Well, let's review some of those options. So number one, Lincoln could choose to reinforce the fort. This is really what the public wanted, at least the Northern public. But Lincoln understood that by reinforcing, it would probably lead to fighting. He did not want to be responsible for the war, and that is a key factor here. All right, Lincoln is already understanding that war is most likely going to be thrust upon him. Right? I mean, the part of the nation's already seceded. So he's going to do everything in his power to make it seem as if they are bringing the war to him, not the opposite, right? If he does anything that seems as if it is a slight against the South, or that he is provoking the South at all, they are going to see that as an act of war, and they will have reason to go to war with the Union and with Lincoln. But that is what the public wants, to reinforce. So we'll come back to this here in a second. The other option, you could pull the troops out. This would be a peace gesture, if you will, that in this way, to kind of tell the South Carolinian government, we do not want to be responsible for starting a war. We're going to withdraw our troops. But that has some major consequences because not only does Lincoln appear weak, I mean, after all, this is Union property. I mean, this fort is this belongs to the military, the federal government. So, if you just withdraw and you basically hand it over to the Southern, you give them legitimacy, and that is going to be something that Lincoln continually tries to deny them legitimacy, that this government exists, that the secession is legal in any way. He never technically accepts the fact that the South really has seceded. Okay, they're in rebellion for sure, but full secession, Lincoln would not agree with that. And there's some legalistic reasons for that we'll cover later on. Another problem with pulling troops is that, man, you're really going to divide. You're going to divide Northern opinion, right? Like we said, it's already controversial in a couple different ways. So dividing Northern opinion is not something you need to do. But what if you did the following? Resupply, but not reinforce. So option one was reinforce, send more troops. That was going to probably cost South Carolina. But what if you just send to resupply? Ultimately, this is the decision. He actually goes as far as notifying South Carolina government. Listen, we are not reinforcing. We're simply giving them supplies that they need to provide, but we're not reinforcing this. The results, though. The result is that the Confederate cabinet, led by Jefferson Davis, Confederate government basically authorized an attack, and they ordered the main general, their Beauregard, to attack the fort, level the fort before any would be. I should mention, I need to mention it again, but remember back to the last time we discussed this in the last week, there was an attempt made by President Lincoln. Remember, they actually fired on the ships. So, that's another factor that plays into this. Lincoln knows that they are trigger happy. So he doesn't want to do that. So, option three fits in the best option. But either way, Confederate government decides that they need to act. They end up giving orders to Beauregard. So firing does open up at 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, 1861. The soldiers inside, they will hold out for 2 days, and they will finally have to surrender the fort on April 14th. Word reaches Lincoln that Fort Sumter has been given up, and the following day, after South Carolina does take control of the fort, the Confederate government takes control of the fort. The following day, April 15th, is a milestone in this early period because Lincoln will proclaim that he issues a proclamation that calls for 75,000 militiamen into national service for 90 days. 90 days. This first group that is signing up, volunteering, they are only going to be in service for 90 days. And I want to come back to this point later on because this kind of gets into the mentality of the age on how a war would actually be played out. And it turns out it's very incorrect. And it's going to put the North in a very tough bind. On the other hand, though, if you told people they were going to sign up for 2 years, you probably wouldn't get the 75,000. So it's kind of a catch-22. So let's go ahead and take a look at at this point, I should mention also that, at this point, the Confederacy will be fully formed. At this point, the remaining states, those border states, Virginia, I think I don't have it in front of me. I think Tennessee, this is when they join as well. But either way, this is when the rest of the Confederacy joins up officially, and the Confederacy, for the most part, is formed after this. Well, let's take a look at both the Northern and Southern strategy throughout this war. And before I begin, I just alluded to this with the 90-day enlistment. almost every war in modern history is fought using the tactics of the last war. Right? You might have heard this before. Most famously, you've probably studied in World War I about the Battle of the Somme, where the British, they basically led frontal assault after frontal assault at the Germans, who had machine guns. I mean, that was a brand new invention. And they were leveled. They were absolutely leveled. 60,000 men dying in a single day of fighting at the Battle of the Somme. Wars are the strategy, at least initially, of most wars tends to reflect the past war, all right, the last one that was fought. It takes a while for strategy to catch up. Many historians have referred to the U.S. Civil War as the first modern war. And in a lot of ways, that is correct. We're going to talk about that. The Industrial Revolution has begun. Now, it's in its early throes at this point, but, it has begun. And, the weapons are becoming deadlier. The rifling allows for much more accurate shooting. So there's a lot of changes that have taken place, but yet the strategy has not changed. You think about what the last war was, not necessarily in America, but in the world, right? That is what these generals have been studying. Okay, the last major set of wars, like that incorporated a huge, multiple nations, was really the Napoleonic Wars, right? In Napoleonic warfare, there were a lot of times where Napoleon would have one big battle that would kind of decide it all, right? And so that was kind of the thinking, frankly, of both sides, that there is going to be one big battle, and it might be horrible, it might be bloody, but it's going to decide the war. It's obviously not the case. All right. So let's take a look, a further breakdown here of the Northern and Southern strategy. The Northern strategy: demoralize and defeat. This idea of one climactic battle in which large forces kind of amass an enemy's weak point and demoralize them. Completely put. The North has the soldiers, they have the weapons, they have the popular, they have all the stuff that they know they should win this war, and they're thinking if we can just have that one battle, demoralize them, that surely they wouldn't want to fight again. They underestimate the South. Okay, they wholeheartedly underestimate the South in their willingness to fight. Now, along with this strategy, they also wanted to take action by sea. And we're going to talk more about this plan later on. But on April 19th, so this is 4 days after he calls for 75,000 volunteers and sets out a quota for all the states, he also orders a blockade to form. Okay, all Confederate ports are going to fall under a Union naval blockade. Now, even though the North really didn't have too effective of a navy, it's still, and I'll say this whole blockade, I've read different things. Some say it was very effective, some say it wasn't. We're going to talk later on about blockade runners, where these fast ships for the age would try to outrun the blockade, and we'll get into that later on. But Lincoln is understanding that we do need to kind of choke out the South economically. We need to make sure that they are not allowing, it's not business as usual in the South. So that blockade is really key, and it's going to shut the southern ports down, which of course is very important because in the South, most of the crops in the South are cotton, especially in the deep South. You can't eat cotton. So, they're going to try to cut out the major food sources from the Confederacy. And at this time, one major food source was actually Texas. They were bringing in a lot of food from Texas. And we're going to talk about how they used the Mississippi to try and cut that out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Southern strategy. Let's take a look at what the South is doing, their plan of attack. Now, the South knows that they are in a bad spot. They are outmanned. They are outgunned. They're basically surrounded from the very beginning, but they believe they can win. And there's one teensy tiny little factor that makes them really think that they can win, and that is a war called the American Revolution. right? You go back 100 years before, and the stories that every Southerner has been raised upon are the patriotic heroes of the American Revolution who took on the big bag tyrant of King George. Well, now you have King Lincoln, right? Who has the strongest army on the continent. Um, it's a similar situation for the Southerners. They see themselves as the patriots. They see themselves as outmanned, outgunned, but you know what? They're going to win this war. And they have good reason. I mean, it's not exactly just a fantasy either. Remember, the American Revolution was won in the South, right? Even though the big cities like New York and Boston, they fell to the British eventually. The American Revolution was won in the South. Once they got the British to start chasing them around on their home territory, that's how we won the war. So that's what you're going to see initially in Southern strategy. Okay, so I just want to say that they really think that they can win this war, and frankly, they almost do. Which, I mean, good Lord, I don't know what modern day America or the world would look like had they won. But either way, they do have good reason to think that they can do this. Um, there are a lot of assumptions that the North, that the South is also dealing with in terms of their resources and how much time they have left. So Robert E. Lee is understanding that it does need to be a quick war, and I'll kind of get into that in a second. Even with all the statistical disadvantages, regardless of the plan that the Confederacy undertook, whether it was an offensive plan in attacking the North, or whether it was a defensive way for them to come to us, they did know that the North had money, men, material, and they're aware of that. So I'm on the point one there, awareness. They are aware that they are outgunned, that their soldiers are not perhaps as trained as well. And so they're going to have to move quick. So moving down to point two, if they're going to win this war, it has to be a quick war. They have limited time to achieve their goals. If everybody's moving at the exact same pace, using the exact same resources, the South will run out first. All right, so they are making it a mission to get this war done quickly. Number three, and man, this is the key, exploit mistakes, and that they do. We are going to talk time and time again about how Northern generals in the Eastern Theater in particular make key mistakes, or how McClellan doesn't, chase down a Confederate army when he does beat them, or doesn't take Richmond when he has the opportunity, and probably could have. Those are key mistakes, and Robert E. Lee was the best at exposing those mistakes and making sure that the North paid for them. So in reality, the South knows that the Confederate victory is just as much in the hands of Northerners and the decisions that they're making as it is in the South. So Southern victory was possible. They knew this. If the North, number one, lacked determination, right? They know that most, maybe not most, but a lot of the Northern armies made up of immigrants. Are they really wanting to fight and die for this country that they may have just gotten off the boat? They have to question, whether the determination of the North to continue a long war is really there. Also, are they going to adequately apply the full resources? Like we said, they have trains, railroad lines, but are they? Does that actually turn into an advantage in the long run? So the South has to really discourage them, and we're going to see guerrilla warfare in various parts take place, and cutting of telegraph wire and destruction of railroad track and things like that. So one big thing, propaganda is such a key piece in every major war. One key thing is they are going to try and sow seeds of dissatisfaction. They're going to do a couple things. Number one, we are going to see eventually they do invade the North. They take the war to the North. And so, they're wanting the people to feel the war, and they want them scared. They want Northerners to give up. Also, 1862 is going to be a big year because it's an election year, not a presidential election, but a congressional election. All right. And you're going to see the strategy really amp up for the Southerners. Robert E. Lee is going to get really busy right before the election because he wants a number of Northern defeats as people go to the ballots to go vote for representatives and senators, right? There, he wants them to vote for anti-war politicians, which there were a number of them. So anyways, we will talk about that later. I'm once again getting off the point. Number 4 there, foreign aid. Lee did not expect any foreign aid from other nations. Frankly, their cause was not a popular one. Other nations had already outlawed slavery. Britain had outlawed it in 1833. France had outlawed it in 1794 with the French Revolution. Slavery was a dying institution, and frankly, everyone knew that, even the Southerners. But it was their way of life, and they were willing to fight and possibly die to defend it. But back to the point, Lee is not expecting any foreign nation, and I mentioned Britain and France in particular because those would have been the two that most likely would have, turned the tide. It's not going to happen here, and he's right. It doesn't happen. There's moments, especially like I said, the first year of the war goes extremely poorly for the North. There are moments in which it does look as if the Southern armies are going to be victorious, and there's maybe an attempt or a thought, hey, maybe now's the time to go get foreign aid, but ultimately that never happens. Common goals. Let's take a look at what the common goals are of both the North and the South. Capture a capital. Like every good board game about war, the goal is to capture the capital. And what's interesting about this war is that the two capitals are less than 100 miles away from one another. Washington, D.C., all right, which sits in between Virginia and Maryland, and Richmond, the capital of Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. They are 100 miles away from, I think, 90 some odd miles away from each other. The initial phases of this war are really going to be about those armies bouncing around and trying to get in between one another to defend their capital. Both sides realize that if they can take the capital, think about how demoralizing that would be. First of all, you've lost the capital for either side, but also what that does to communication for the defeated side. If you take their capital, you force all of their politicians to the people that are leading the charge, the presidents, the war cabinet. You are forcing them to go on the run. It's not as easy to communicate when you have a full setup. So you capture the capital, big for morale, big against the opponent's morale, and also disrupt communication, disrupt their ability to organize. So that is a major common goal on both sides. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the Northern leadership. These are names that I am going to be using throughout the lecture. And I think a lot of them need to be discussed to understand why some of the actions are taken at times that they are. So I'm going to start with both sides by talking about the presidents. Of course, we have Abraham Lincoln. Now, today we understand Lincoln to be, one of our greatest presidents ever. Defending the Union at a time where it really could have collapsed, and at points looked like it was about to. Lincoln, in a lot of ways, was the epitome of the American dream. He had been born quite poor. He was from a border state, Kentucky. His father had been a frontiersman, had gone out there pretty early. Lincoln grew up. He was born in Kentucky, but he kind of learned the woods and the wilderness. Later on, he will move to Illinois, where he calls his home. And that is where we ran into him in our last unit, right? We saw Lincoln emerge as a national celebrity after the senatorial race with Stephen Douglas and the so-called Lincoln-Douglas debates after it was published and pushed out in book form. Lincoln became a household name as politicians for how eloquent he was and how well he summarized his views on slavery. Remember, he lost that Senate race to Douglas, but it did pave the way for him to be the Republican nominee for president in 1860. The South feared Lincoln. He ultimately will be known as the great emancipator. and the South feared that aspect of him. They did think that he was elected to end slavery. They thought he was a radical, an extremist, that the first chance he had, he would end slavery. But I want to remind you not only of those debates that we listened to, where Lincoln said, my goal is not to end slavery. It is, really to contain slavery. Much different. But I want to remind you of a quote I read from his first inaugural address. And I think this really puts it in perspective. He is not there to create war. Lincoln wants this thing over with, right? But let me read you the quote from the inaugural address. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve it. Preserve, protect, and defend it. My job is to defend this government and this country, okay? You do not have any job that says you have to destroy it, right? But I have to defend this." So he's saying, listen, if you force war upon us, you will have war, but I am not here to bring war to you. He did think secession was illegal. And like I mentioned earlier, there are going to be, he's a lawyer after all, so there's going to be phrasing that he will use in which he does not recognize the Confederacy as a separate state. He does not believe that they have legally seceded. He doesn't even think that's possible, which many of the founding fathers would agree, including we looked at James Madison, who helped write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But he was willing to use federal force to preserve the Union and the laws. So he was a strong leader, but one that ultimately was trying to lead this country into peace. But war was thrust upon him. Now, Southerners would wholeheartily disagree with that. I'll never forget. I had in my first year of undergraduate. One of my professors, who's from Mississippi, had this thick draw. He said, I always grew up, hearing stories about Lincoln as the villain in the story. And I just remember sitting up in my chair thinking, what? Never in my entire life had I ever heard Lincoln referred to as the villain, right? So I think it's interesting. This guy wasn't incredibly old. He was probably in his 50s at the time. For him within the, mid 20th century, that's still the story that's being spread in the South. So again, it is all a matter of perspective and bias. That is for sure. B, let's talk about the main Union generals. First of all, there is going to be a big change in leadership after the failures of the first couple years. But the main man in the first few years is George B. McClellan. McClellan, he acts the part. Everyone liked McClellan, but he's overly cautious. He is not willing to take his gains and exploit them. He is almost to the point of paranoid. Repeatedly, Lincoln will tell him, attack, attack, attack. And McClellan says, they outnumber us. I can't. In reality, he wasn't outnumbered. In reality, if he had followed Lincoln's orders, the war very well may have ended years sooner and saving hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's a very sad, cautionary tale, I guess, of being overly cautious. He did attempt to take Richmond. That was his goal, as I said, but he did ultimately retreat from that attack. And when he's retreating from a weaker Southern army, eventually he has enough, he being Lincoln, and he will later replace him with General Pope first, and then later on Ulysses S. Grant, who we will talk about now. So Ulysses S. Grant, they didn't know it at the time, but he would ultimately be kind of the main Union general that would emerge from this. He has a lot of victories out west, which kind of gets his name placed on Lincoln's desk. Ultimately, he will become president. He's another hero of this war, and he will become a president after Johnson. Grant, as I said, will focus out west, and he will lead an army called the Army of the Tennessee. And his Army of the Tennessee has great success, whereas the Union's getting their tail kicked out east, Grant is kicking tail out west. I mean, he has victory after victory. That does not mean it didn't come at a cost. Grant takes on the nickname the Butcher because of how many men die under his leadership. So, and he struggled with that for the rest of his life. I mean, he was well aware of how many souls had been lost because of his orders. I would not wish that upon anyone. But he was the rising star, and I will mention that he was not a man without personal conflict. He was an alcoholic. In fact, he probably would have been offered a higher position, or at least, the generalship in the East. But it was well known that he was an alcoholic, and it may have, in fact, at one point, I think he even leaves the army, and then comes back once this war begins. So sadly, he struggled with his own demons and that addiction, but thankfully he was able to overcome them to lead the Union Army to victory. He is going to turn the tide of this war in 1864 with a campaign called the Overland Campaign, and that will be the one that destroys Lee's army. So Grant does become the general that secures Union victory. Excuse me, coffee break. All right, third, we got William Tecumseh Sherman. I mentioned Sherman here because he is going to be another major face here. He's often working under Grant. In fact, when Grant leaves to go out east, Sherman will be the one that takes control of armies in the west. Later on, we will see him marching through places like Chattanooga, but we're also going to see him make the ultimate push towards Atlanta. And in 1865, that famous Sherman's March to the Sea. We're going to see Sherman institute, frankly, what we call total war, where everything is fair game. He wanted Southerners, especially in regions like Georgia that hadn't been affected as much. He wanted them to pay. He wanted them to know that war is hell, and he was going to bring that hell upon them. So he was pretty ruthless, and we're going to see him first in the West, and then ultimately he will be one of the last Union advances pushing to the southeast, to the sea. The other notable generals, McDowell, Pope, Burnside, General Hooker, and Meade, all of these guys will be very important throughout. I would keep this page handy of your notes because you are going to be referring to this. I'm going to throw some of these names out there, and I'll try to remind you which side they're on, but I know it's hard to kind of memorize all these various names. Let's talk about the Southern leadership. This will be our last slide here. So Southern leadership at the top, the man pictured on the right-hand side there, Jefferson Davis. Also born in Kentucky, just like Lincoln, and raised in Mississippi. So when Lincoln went north, Davis went south. He did attend West Point Military Academy, and he had served just like Lincoln in the Black Hawk Wars. So he had veteran experience, and he had also served in the Mexican-American War. And I want to remind you guys that these officers. Many of them do have war experience. They had fought, about 20 years before in the Mexican-American War, and they remember that experience. They remember, what works, and these are not green soldiers. These are men who have seen war and are ready to lead their armies to victory. So Jefferson Davis, he was a veteran, had experience in multiple wars, would later return to politics. He became a senator in Mississippi, and he does elevate to the role of Secretary of War. Now, today we call that Secretary of Defense. It's interesting how they were able to just kind of flip-flop those names with exact opposites, but Secretary of War at the time under Franklin Pierce, who we've seen in our last unit as well. He was a strong defender of states' rights, and again, this is kind of the main motto, the main message of the South, that ultimately states' right to make their own decisions, and of course about slavery. So the not to jump back into that again. Let's talk about the main Confederate generals. The main two, and there's a lot of guys that we could get into, but the two that probably were the most important were Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Robert E. Lee, his dad had been a Revolutionary War hero. And so Lee was already a household name among the entire nation. He also went to West Point, just like Jefferson Davis did. They were not there at the same time, but Lee was offered when the war broke out. Robert E. Lee was such a strong figure already before the war itself, such a public figure that Lincoln actually goes to Lee and asks him to lead the Union armies. I think Lee really struggled with that because I think he did feel a sense of duty. But ultimately, he made the fateful decision that he could not fight against fellow Virginians. And so he declined Lincoln's office, his role that he was trying to get him to accept. And he did end up becoming the main general in the Eastern Theater for the Confederacies. His command in the field is brilliant. We are going to talk about some battles that guys, frankly, they are still studying to this day in military academies throughout the world, because Lee would be completely outnumbered. I mean, 2-1, and would somehow emerge victorious. He would do things that textbooks specifically said don't do, but he knew that he was taking advantage of a northern weakness, and we're going to see some pretty brilliant strategy emerge from Robert E. Lee. In fact, almost all of his victories come against superior numbers. Almost always, the North had superior numbers than the Southern Army, but Lee emerged victorious. So ultimately, strategically, he's unable to secure the victory. This offensive he leads into the North, into Gettysburg, ultimately it fails. But we'll talk about it at the time. Ultimately, I still see why Lee had to do it. They were running low on food supplies, but ultimately it did doom the Confederacy for sure. Stonewall Jackson, another interesting figure, a hero to the South. He was deeply pious. I mentioned Stonewall Jackson during our last unit when I said that after some of these slave rebellions, states had begun outlawing the ability to educate a slave. And we talked about how Stonewall Jackson actually violated those laws because he wanted to educate his slaves to the point where they could read. And the reason being, he wanted them to be able to read the Bible. Stonewall Jackson was a very pious man. He was very religious and probably the most out of any of the Southern leadership. He was very quirky, though. There are a couple stories that I'll share very quickly. And some I've heard may not be true, but one that absolutely was true, as far as I know, was that Stonewall Jackson's favorite treat that he would enjoy was sucking on a lemon, which I don't know. It sounds disgusting, but I guess he never got scurvy probably because of that. But sucking on a lemon, he was well known to do that. I have heard one other story about his quirkiness in which he believed that at times he would feel like his blood was uneven. And so he would raise his arm up in the air for hours at a time to even out the blood. I think I've read before that maybe is a myth, but either way, it kind of adds to the mythos of Stonewall Jackson. Quirks aside, another brilliant general for the South. He will be the one that leads the charge at Bull Run and gets a very early victory for the Confederacy. The Shenandoah Valley campaign, in which he basically has the Union Army you're going to be shocked at how many miles these men are marching on a daily basis. I'm thinking, if I remember correctly, it was 50 miles. I don't know. It was crazy amount. We'll get to those stats later on. He's going to lead major campaigns then, and then Chancellorsville is also another major battle for the South, in which they gain a very strategic victory there. It's, I guess, tragic, but ultimately quite fateful for the rest of the war. That it's after Chancellorsville that Stonewall Jackson will actually be shot and killed on accident, friendly fire, by some of his own men. Um, and sadly for Jackson, he actually will be shot. He'll be shot in the arm, which they have to amputate. Which we'll talk about medical procedures at this time. It's just horrible, very painful. He basically lay there in pain for days on end before ultimately succumbing to his wounds. But yeah, he was out scouting a position as the men that were acting as sentries fired and ultimately killed him. So he will become kind of a, I mentioned the lost cause yesterday. He becomes one of these mythological figures about the lost cause. If only Stonewall Jackson had survived, that perhaps the South would have won. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, but he enters the pantheon of Confederate generalship and leadership during this time. Other notable generals, Beauregard, who we've already mentioned with the attack on Fort Sumter. Longstreet, he'll be notable at many major battles. Bragg, Jeb Stuart, and then finally Hill will be another major general for the South. So again, note those. I'll be mentioning them from time to time with various battles, and we'll get on to it. Next time we meet, we will discuss the theaters of war. We'll talk about exactly where this fighting is occurring, and then we'll also break down the initial phases of the war. We'll talk about the Anaconda Plan, in which the North tries to strangle the South using riverways. And then we'll also get into our first major battles. All right, guys, thanks. And as always, please make sure that if you have any questions at all, please email me. I'd be happy to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks. Have a great day.